Brad Morrison considered the act a form of digital art, a masterpiece of vengeance composed in pixels and shame. He sat back in his $1,000 ergonomic chair, the skyline of the city a glittering testament to his success behind the floor-to-ceiling glass of his corner office. On the massive curved monitor before him, an email draft waited, pregnant with ruin. The recipient was a generic HR address, human.resource@gsadmin.gov. It sounded as gray and boring as Jennifer had been. The General Services Administration, a place of beige cubicles and weak coffee, he imagined. The perfect sterile environment for a woman whose entire personality was a shade of taupe. He had met her at a gallery opening, a favor for a board member. She had been quiet, unassuming, and, he thought at the time, refreshingly simple. Jennifer Chen. Even her name was common. She had claimed to be a mid-level procurement officer, a paper pusher in the vast, faceless bureaucracy of the federal government. She spoke of requisitions and compliance forms with a placid dullness that he found almost exotic. For 6 months, she had been his palate cleanser from the sharp, ambitious women who clawed their way through the tech world. She was soft, pliable, and utterly unimpressed by his wealth, which only made him want to impress her more. The breakup had been her idea. A quiet, firm conversation over dinner at a restaurant he owned a stake in. She had called his business practices ethically questionable, and his character lacking in fundamental decency. The sheer audacity of it had left him speechless. Her, the glorified clerk, passing judgment on him? Brad Morrison, the visionary behind Ethelred Innovations. He had built Ethelred from a garage startup into a billion-dollar data mining behemoth. He was a king in this city, a titan of industry. And this mousy little bureaucrat had dared to lecture him on morality before walking away. The humiliation had festered, turning into a cold, hard knot of fury in his gut. He had given her everything, access to his world, expensive gifts she accepted with polite but distant gratitude, a glimpse of real power, and she had thrown it back in his face. So he had decided to remind her of her place. He had trawled through his cloud backups, finding the photos. Moments of intimacy he had cajoled her into, promising they were just for him. He saw them not as memories of affection, but as assets. Now they were weapons. He attached a half-dozen of the most compromising images to the email. The subject line was simple, professional. Regarding employee Jennifer Chen. The body of the text was equally sterile. To whom it may concern, it has come to my attention that one of your employees, Jennifer Chen, is engaging in conduct unbecoming of a federal employee. I believe the attached photos speak for themselves. I trust you will take appropriate action. He imagined the scene, the email arriving in some drab HR inbox, the shocked gasp of the clerk who opened it, the hurried, hushed conference with a supervisor, the summons, Jennifer, standing red-faced and trembling before a panel of her gray-suited superiors, the firing, the shame, the utter destruction of her meticulously boring little life. It was perfect, a clean, precise, and devastating strike. He clicked send. The email vanished from his outbox. A sense of profound satisfaction washed over him. He had restored the natural order of things. He was powerful. She was weak. He had simply provided a reminder. He swiveled his chair to face the window, looking down at the city he owned. The matter, as far as he was concerned, was closed. The first day passed in a pleasant haze of anticipation. Brad went about his business with a spring in his step. He led a board meeting with his usual blend of charismatic bluster and ruthless efficiency, securing another 9-figure funding round for a new data parsing algorithm. He took his senior VPs out for a celebratory lunch at a restaurant where the steaks cost more than most people's weekly grocery bills. Throughout the day, he found himself checking his phone, a smirk playing on his lips. He expected a text, a panicked call, an angry, tearful voicemail from Jennifer. Something, anything to confirm his victory. But there was only silence. He told himself it was the shock. She was probably curled up in a ball in her sterile apartment, too broken to even function. The thought was deeply pleasing. By the second day, the silence had begun to feel less like victory and more like a void. He logged into his encrypted email account, the one he had used to send the photos, and checked the sent folder. The email was there. It had been delivered. No bounce-back notification. He had even used a tracking pixel, a little trick from his marketing department. It confirmed the email had been opened 12 times in fact, from an IP address that geolocated to Washington, D.C., so they had seen it. Her bosses knew. Why was there no news? He scoured the internet, searching her name, the GSA, looking for any hint of a scandal, a personnel change. Nothing. It was baffling. He had deployed a nuclear weapon into her life, and there was no mushroom cloud, just quiet. It began to irritate him, a persistent itch under his skin. He considered the possibility that they were covering it up, protecting their own, a quiet dismissal, a forced resignation to avoid a public mess. That had to be it. Still, the lack of a personal reaction from Jennifer was unnerving. The woman he knew, or thought he knew, would have crumbled. She was sensitive, private, and valued her reputation above all else. This silence was out of character. It was as if he had thrown a boulder into a lake, and it had simply vanished without a ripple. His own office, usually a sanctuary of power, started to feel confining. The whispers and sycophantic laughter of his employees, which normally fueled his ego, now sounded hollow. He snapped at his assistant for bringing him coffee that was 2 degrees too cool. He paced the length of his office, the city lights mocking his impotence. He had delivered the perfect revenge, but he was being denied the satisfaction of witnessing the results. On the third day, the itch turned into a full-blown rash of paranoia. He called Mark, a friend who worked in lobbying and had connections all over D.C. He kept the inquiry vague. "Hey, Mark, quick question. You ever hear of any shake-ups over at the GSA? Specifically in procurement?" Mark's laugh crackled over the phone. "The GSA? Brad, nobody hears about anything at the GSA. It's the government's attic. Why? You trying to sell them some paper clips?" "Just curious," Brad muttered, his frustration growing. "Heard a name Jennifer Chen? Wondering if she's still there." "Never heard of her," Mark said. "Look, I gotta run. Big meeting on the Hill. Let's grab a drink next week." Brad hung up, feeling a cold dread begin to coil in his stomach. This was wrong. All wrong. His plan had been flawless in its cruelty, but it had failed in its execution. Or rather, it had executed, but the target had not reacted as predicted. It was a miscalculation, and Brad Morrison did not make miscalculations. He began to retrace his steps, his mind racing. The email address. Human resources exay.admin.gov. It was what she had told him. He had verified it on a public-facing government directory. It was real, her job title, Procurement Officer GS-12. It was all there. It was all real. So what had gone wrong? His thoughts drifted back to their time together. He tried to recall moments of weakness, of vulnerability, but his memory kept snagging on odd details. The way she would listen, truly listen, when he boasted about Ethelred's technical capabilities, asking questions that seemed naive at the time, but, in retrospect, were unnervingly specific. She had asked about their data encryption protocols, their server architecture, their methods for acquiring user data. He had explained it all condescendingly, happy to lecture the little government clerk on the brilliance of the private sector. He remembered a scar, a thin white line just above her collarbone, that she had dismissed as a childhood accident. He remembered the strange calluses on her hands, which she'd claimed were from a renewed interest in rock climbing. He remembered her fluency in 3 languages, which she had passed off as a hobby. Little inconsistencies, little things that didn't fit the bland, boring picture she had painted of herself. At the time, he had seen them as charming quirks. Now, they seemed like clues to a puzzle he hadn't even known he was supposed to be solving. The dread in his gut intensified. He felt like a man who had confidently stepped onto what he thought was solid ground, only to find himself sinking into quicksand. The silence from Washington was no longer just an absence of news. It felt active, malevolent. It felt like the deep, patient silence of a predator, waiting for its prey to exhaust itself. David Chen, Ethelred's chief legal counsel, sat across from Brad's sprawling mahogany desk, his face a mask of professional concern. David was a careful man, a man who measured his words and his risks with equal precision. He had been with Brad from the beginning, and his caution had saved the company from legal trouble more than once. "Brad, we need to talk about the SEC inquiry," David began, pushing a thin file across the desk. "They're asking for full access to the trading logs from the second quarter. Specifically, the trades made by the executive board right before the announcement of the Nimbus contract." Brad waved a dismissive hand. "It's a fishing expedition, David. We've been through this. Our lawyers will stonewall them. Standard procedure." "This feels different," David pressed, his eyes narrowing slightly. "The language in this subpoena is specific. It's surgical. It's like they already know what they're looking for. They're not fishing. They're reeling in a catch." "You're paranoid," Brad scoffed, though the word sent a fresh jolt of anxiety through him. David leaned forward. "Am I? For the last 6 months, you've been unusually distracted. You brought that woman, Jennifer, to company events. You were with her constantly. And then suddenly, you weren't. And ever since she's been gone, you've been volatile. Now I'm getting subpoenas that read like a prosecutor's closing argument. Did something happen, Brad? Something I should know about?" Brad's jaw tightened. The implication was clear. David suspected a link. "My personal life is none of your business, David, and it has nothing to do with the company." "Everything you do has to do with the company," David shot back, his voice rising for the first time. "If you've made an enemy, if there's someone out there with a grudge who might have information, I need to know. We need to get ahead of it." Brad thought of the photos, the email, an act of personal revenge. It couldn't be connected to this. It was impossible. Jennifer was a nobody, a clerk. She didn't have the knowledge or the power to instigate a federal investigation. The idea was absurd, but the timing was inconvenient. "It was a bad breakup," Brad said, his voice clipped. "That's all. She's irrelevant." David stared at him for a long moment, his gaze searching. He seemed to sense the lie, or at least the omission. "Nothing is irrelevant when you're dealing with the federal government, Brad. A disgruntled ex is the first person they talk to. What does she know?" "She knows nothing," Brad insisted, a little too forcefully. "I was careful. She saw the lifestyle, not the machinery behind it." "I hope you're right," David said, standing up. He left the file on the desk. "Because the people who wrote this subpoena, they seem to know exactly how the machinery works. Be careful, Brad." After David left, Brad stared at the file. The legal jargon was dense, but the message was terrifyingly clear. They were looking at specific dates, specific transactions, all linked to a period when he had been flaunting his success to Jennifer. He had bragged to her about the Nimbus contract weeks before it was public, laughing about how they had outsmarted the competition. He had explained in simple terms she could understand how their algorithms could predict market shifts based on illegally scraped data. He had been showing off, and she had been listening. He felt a sudden, desperate urge to act, to do something to regain control. The silence from her was the problem. He needed to force a reaction, to prove to himself that she was the broken, powerless woman he believed her to be. His paranoia and his ego coiled together into a toxic, impulsive decision. He picked up his phone and dialed a number he knew by heart. A sleazy tech blogger he sometimes fed information to in exchange for positive coverage. "Milo," he said when the man answered, "I have a story for you, a big one. It's about a government employee, a real hypocrite, and I have proof. Photos." He felt a sick thrill as he spoke, the familiar rush of power returning. He would escalate. He would take the story public. He would burn her life to the ground so thoroughly that there would be nothing left but ash. He would force the world to see her as he saw her. In that moment of supreme arrogance, he didn't realize he wasn't lighting a fire. He was tripping a wire. Miles away, in a secure, windowless room in the Hoover Building, a red flag appeared on a monitor. A junior analyst leaned closer, his eyes widening. He double-tapped a key, bringing the audio file to the forefront. "Ma'am," he said into his headset, his voice tense, "you need to hear this. The target is making a move. He's trying to leak the package to the press." In her own office down the hall, Jennifer Chen listened to the playback. Her face remained impassive, but her eyes were cold as steel. Brad's voice, arrogant and cruel, filled the quiet room. She listened to him plot her public humiliation, using the very evidence that would seal his own fate. She had hoped he would be smart enough to just let it go, to accept his quiet defeat. But she knew men like Brad. Their ego was a cage they could never escape. His need to dominate, to have the last word, would always be his undoing. He had to prove he was the one in control, even as the walls were closing in. She had spent 18 months inside his life, 18 months as Jen, the quiet, boring girlfriend, 18 months of enduring his condescension, his casual cruelty, his endless boasting, 18 months of listening, recording, and building a case so airtight that not even his army of high-priced lawyers could find a crack. The corporate fraud, the insider trading, the illegal data harvesting, that was the mission. It was a massive case that would dismantle one of the most corrupt companies in the tech sector. But this last part, this was personal. He had crossed a line that had nothing to do with financial crimes. He had tried to use her body, her privacy, as a weapon to destroy her. And in doing so, he had given her the final, perfect piece of evidence. The revenge porn email was a confession, a signed and dated admission of his character, sent directly to the federal government. It demonstrated motive, malice, and a level of recklessness that was prosecutors' gold. She looked at the tactical plan on her screen, the culmination of a year and a half of meticulous work. Every entry point to Ethelred Tower was covered. Every server was targeted for seizure. Every member of Brad's executive team had a file. The plan was ready. She had just been waiting for the right moment to give the order. Brad, in his infinite arrogance, had just given it to her. She keyed her microphone. Her voice was calm, clear, and utterly devoid of emotion. "He's escalated, so will we. Execute the warrants. All teams, green light. Go now." The board meeting was at its peak. Brad stood before a holographic display outlining his vision for Ethelred's global expansion. His VPs and board members were rapt, their faces a mixture of greed and admiration. He was in his element, a conductor orchestrating a symphony of profit and power. The paranoia of the last few days had melted away, replaced by the familiar warmth of control. He had taken action. The blogger Milo was preparing the story. By tomorrow, Jennifer Chen's name would be mud. That was when the doors to the boardroom burst open. They didn't just open. They exploded inwards, the sound of a magnetic lock being overridden, echoing like a gunshot. Two men in dark suits, flanking a dozen more agents in tactical gear with FBI, emblazoned in bold yellow letters across their chests, swarmed into the room. The silence was instantaneous and absolute. The holographic display flickered, casting shifting blue light on the agents' grim faces. Brad froze, his mouth half open. For a surreal moment, he thought it was a prank, a corporate stunt. But the cold, hard barrels of the rifles pointed in his direction were unmistakably real. The world tilted on its axis. "Nobody move!" one of the lead agents commanded, his voice cutting through the stunned silence. "Hands where I can see them." The VPs and board members, men who commanded markets and moved billions with a single phone call, raised their hands like frightened schoolchildren. Their faces were pale with shock and confusion. The two lead agents, Miller and Russo, walked directly toward Brad. Their movements were economical and precise. They moved with an authority that dwarfed his own. "Bradford Morrison?" Agent Miller asked, though it wasn't a question. Brad found his voice, though it came out as a strangled whisper. "What is this? What's the meaning of this?" "You're under arrest," Agent Russo said, his voice flat. He produced a pair of handcuffs. "You have the right to remain silent." "Arrest? For what?" Brad stammered, his mind refusing to process the reality of the situation. He looked around at the faces of his colleagues, saw his own disbelief mirrored in their eyes. This was his kingdom. These were his subjects. And these men were committing treason. "This is insane. My lawyer—" "Your lawyer has been notified," Miller cut him off, "and he'll have a lot to talk to you about. Let's start with wire fraud. Securities fraud, conspiracy to commit money laundering, and 16 counts of violating the Computer Fraud and Abuse Act. Each charge was a hammer blow, shattering the glass walls of Brad's self-perception. He stared at the agents, his mind reeling. The SEC inquiry, David's warning, it was real. It was all real. But how? How could they have built such a case? "This is a mistake," he insisted, his voice gaining a desperate edge. "My company is legitimate. We're one of the fastest-growing tech firms in the country." Agent Russo let out a short, humorless laugh. "Your company is a criminal enterprise built on stolen data and insider trading, Mr. Morrison. We've been watching it for a very long time." Brad's mind raced, searching for an explanation, a scapegoat, a disgruntled employee, a corporate rival. And then a new thought, dark and insidious, surfaced. Jennifer, it had to be her. She had been feeding them information. The quiet little clerk was a snake. The thought filled him with a fresh wave of rage, momentarily eclipsing his fear. "I know who's behind this," he spat, a sneer twisting his lips. "It's Jennifer Chen, isn't it? My ex-girlfriend. This is her revenge for a bad breakup. It's pathetic." He looked at his board members, trying to rally them. "You see, this is a personal vendetta. She's feeding them lies because I dumped her." Agent Miller and Agent Russo exchanged a look. It was a look of profound pity, the kind a person gives a cornered animal that is too stupid to realize the trap has already closed. "You're right about one thing," Miller said, his voice dropping low. "This is about Jennifer Chen, but you've got the story a little backward." Russo took a step closer, his eyes locking onto Brad's. "Let me add one more charge to your list, Mr. Morrison, a federal one. Willful distribution of private, intimate images with intent to harass and intimidate, a violation of the Violence Against Women Act, Section 113. Brad actually laughed, a strained, hysterical sound. "You're arresting me for sending a few photos? To her boss? That's a civil matter at best. You're grasping at straws." "Ordinarily, you might be right," Agent Miller said calmly, "but you made a few critical errors. You see, you didn't just send those photos to her boss. You sent them to an official government email address, which constitutes using interstate wires to commit the crime, making it a federal matter. And you sent them to what you thought was a sleepy little HR department." A sense of unreality descended on Brad. The agent's words seemed to be coming from a great distance. His entire reality was dissolving, melting away like a Dali painting. "You sent those photos to her direct chain of command," Russo continued, his voice relentless. "You sent a copy to the office of the director of the FBI, and you sent the original email, the one with the tracking pixel, directly to the primary inbox of the person in charge of this entire investigation." Brad stared at him, his mind a blank canvas of horror. He didn't understand. He couldn't understand. Agent Miller leaned in, his voice dropping to a confidential whisper that was somehow louder than a shout in the silent room. "You sent those pictures of Jennifer Chen to the assistant director in charge of the Federal Bureau of Investigation's Cybercrime Division." He paused, letting the words hang in the air for a terrible, eternal second. "Assistant Director Jennifer Chen." The name hit Brad with the force of a physical blow. It was impossible, a dream, a nightmare. The room swam before his eyes. Jennifer, his quiet, boring Jennifer, the mouse, the clerk, an assistant director at the FBI, head of the Cybercrime Division. The pieces of the puzzle, the little inconsistencies he had ignored, slammed into place with dizzying speed. The specific questions about his tech, the scar, the calluses, the languages, the unnerving calm, the silence after he sent the email. It hadn't been the silence of a victim in shock. It had been the silence of an investigator closing a case. He looked at the agents, his arrogance finally completely shattered, replaced by a cold, bottomless terror. "No," he whispered. "No, that's not possible." "Oh, it's very possible," Russo said, a grim satisfaction in his voice. "For 18 months, Assistant Director Chen has been leading Operation Ethelred. She was undercover, in your life, in your house, in your company. She gathered every piece of evidence we needed to take you and your entire corrupt enterprise down. Frankly, the case was already airtight." Miller gestured around the room at the stunned faces of the board members. "We had everything. The insider trading, the wire fraud, all of it. But you, in your infinite wisdom, decided to hand-deliver the cherry on top." "That email you sent," Russo explained, as if speaking to a child, "was the single most self-incriminating document I have ever seen in my career. You authenticated your identity through your encrypted email server. You established clear motive for harassment. You time-stamped the act. You confessed to a federal crime and delivered the evidence directly to the chief investigator. You didn't just incriminate yourself, Mr. Morrison. You gift-wrapped the case for the prosecution." The blood drained from Brad's face. The full scope of his catastrophic miscalculation crashed down on him. He hadn't been punching down at a weak, defenseless woman. He had been taking a swing at the very organization that was poised to destroy him. His act of petty revenge wasn't the killing blow he had intended. It was an act of breathtaking stupidity, a final, fatal error born of pure hubris. The VPs and board members, who moments before had been his loyal disciples, now stared at him with a mixture of horror and contempt. They were not just witnessing the fall of their leader. They were witnessing the fall of their company, their fortunes, their entire world. And it had all been brought about by this man's pathetic, personal vendetta. "Cuff him!" Miller ordered. The cold steel snapped around Brad's wrists. The click echoed in the silent room. A sound of finality. The power that had defined his entire existence evaporated in that instant. He was no longer Brad Morrison, the tech titan. He was a federal prisoner. As the agents led him out of the boardroom, he was forced to perform the one ritual he had always dreaded, the perp walk. He was marched through the open-plan office of Ethelred Innovations, past the hundreds of employees who had once feared and revered him. Their faces were a sea of shock, confusion, and dawning comprehension as they saw their visionary leader in handcuffs, flanked by federal agents. The glass walls of his kingdom had become a fishbowl, and he was the specimen on display. The shame he had so desperately tried to inflict upon Jennifer was now his, magnified 1,000 times over. It was a public, profound, and inescapable humiliation. He had wanted to destroy her world, and in the attempt, he had merely incinerated his own. Back in Washington, Jennifer Chen watched the raid on a live feed from a drone circling Ethelred Tower. She saw the agents swarm the boardroom. She saw Brad's face, a mask of arrogant disbelief curdling into pure terror. She saw the moment of realization, the utter collapse of his carefully constructed world. She felt no joy, no triumph, only a quiet, grim sense of completion. Justice was not about emotion. It was about balance. Brad Morrison had created a world of imbalance, built on deceit and exploitation. Today, the scales had been set right. Agent Miller's voice came through her earpiece. "Subject is in custody, all executives secured. Servers are being mirrored now. The package is secure, ma'am. clean sweep. "Good work, Agent," she replied, her voice even. "Proceed with processing. I want full debriefs from every board member. Offer cooperation deals to the lower-level VPs in exchange for testimony. I want the entire network dismantled by morning." "Understood, Assistant Director." She switched off the feed. The screen went dark. For a moment, she sat in the silence of her office, the weight of the last 18 months settling on her. Living as Jen had been the most challenging assignment of her career. It had required a level of emotional suppression that was draining. She had endured the condescension, the casual sexism, the suffocating ego of a man who saw women as accessories or obstacles. She had played the part of the meek, simple girlfriend, all while mentally cataloging every crime he confessed in his arrogant pillow talk. A knock came at her door. It was Agent Russo, back from the field office, a stack of files in his hand. He placed them on her desk. "The board members are singing like canaries," he reported. "They're all turning on Morrison, trying to save their own skins. The corporate structure is collapsing as we speak. It's a full rout." "As expected," Jennifer said, her eyes scanning the top file. Russo hesitated for a moment. "Ma'am, what he did, what he tried to do to you, it's despicable. I'm glad we were the ones to bring him in." Jennifer looked up from the file, her expression unreadable. "He's a criminal, Agent. We arrested him for his crimes. The revenge porn charge is just one of many. It simply serves as the most potent symbol of his character. A man who believed his power gave him the right to humiliate and degrade anyone he perceived as weaker." "He certainly perceived you wrong," Russo said with a small, grum smile. "He thought he was swatting a fly. He had no idea he was poking a hornet's nest with a stick." Jennifer almost smiled. "He's not the first arrogant man to underestimate a quiet woman, Agent. And he won't be the last. His fundamental flaw was a failure of imagination. He couldn't conceive of a world where he wasn't the most powerful person in the room." The news of Brad Morrison's arrest and the spectacular implosion of Ethelred Innovations dominated the headlines for weeks. The story was a delectable cocktail of corporate greed, high-tech crime, and personal hubris. The detail about the revenge porn email and the true identity of its recipient became a legend in both law enforcement and tech circles. It was a cautionary tale of epic proportions. Brad Morrison, denied bail due to being a flight risk, sat in a federal detention center, stripped of his tailored suits and his sense of invincibility. His army of lawyers was useless against the mountain of evidence Jennifer had compiled. The signed confessions from his entire executive board had sealed his fate. He was facing decades in prison. The revenge porn charge, once the centerpiece of his brilliant plan, was now a footnote in a long list of federal felonies. It was, as the prosecutor would later state in court, merely the clearest window into the defendant's profound moral bankruptcy. His former employees, the ones who had been complicit in his toxic corporate culture, now spoke of Jennifer Chen with a kind of terrified reverence. They remembered the quiet woman at the company picnics, the one the boss had treated like a decorative object. They now understood that while they had been watching their CEO, she had been watching all of them, her placid smile hiding the mind of a master investigator. Jennifer herself never spoke of the case publicly. When the dust settled, she was already immersed in her next investigation, tracking a ring of international hackers who had breached the Federal Reserve. The fall of Brad Morrison was just one victory in a long, quiet war against the forces of corruption and chaos. Her elevation in the eyes of her peers was subtle but significant. She had always been respected for her intellect and her skill. But now there was an added layer of awe. She was the agent who had gone into the lion's den, lived with the beast, and emerged not only unscathed, but with its head on a platter. She was a quiet professional, a woman whose competence spoke far louder than any arrogant boast. The final image of the affair was not of Brad in handcuffs or Jennifer in her office. It was a small classified report that crossed the desk of the FBI director. It was a psychological profile of Brad Morrison, compiled after his arrest. It concluded that he was a classic narcissist, utterly incapable of seeing others as anything more than extensions of his own will. The final line of the report was a testament to Jennifer's strategy. The subject's downfall was not precipitated by the strength of his enemies, but by his absolute inability to accurately assess their capabilities. He was, in the end, defeated not by the FBI, but by his own arrogance. Order had been restored, justice had been served, and in the quiet corridors of power, the work continued, carried on by those who understood that true strength wasn't about the noise you made, but about the results you delivered.